The wheel of time turns and ages come and pass, leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth, and even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again.
Welcome to Through the Glass Columns, a Wheel of Time read-along podcast. Each week, we will be reading, discussing, and digesting a small selection from Robert Jordan's fantasy opus. This quest is led by Tylor, a true Wheel of Time warrior.
I have all stories, ages that were and that will be. And I'll be joined by Greg, a complete novice to the Wheel of Time.
The Wheel of Time and the wheel of a man's life turn alike without pity or mercy.
Join us each week as we read the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time, traveling deeper and deeper through the glass columns.
But what does that even mean?
No. You don't get to find out yet.
Hello and welcome back to Through the Glass Columns. In this case, your weekly read-along Wheel of Time podcast. Hey, are you sick of us? You're getting a lot more of me. My name is Greg, and joining me as always, and it does seem like all the time these days, is Tylor. Tylor, say hello.
Hi, everybody. I know you're not sick of me because I am delightful. Everyone loves hearing me twice a week now that you get to. We are back once again to be discussing, in this case, Amazon, or not Amazon's. Today, we will be discussing Robert Jordan's The Dragon Reborn. We are getting a little bit mixed up because we are right now in the middle of recording the final couple of episodes, one of which will air in just 2 days of our analysis of Amazon's Wheel of Time television show. So we are excited for you to continue joining us for that. Hopefully you've had a chance to check it out. If not, go do that. It's awesome. Regardless of what your position is on the television show, we have some pretty good chapters to review today, and Greg needs to get out of here quickly. So I'm just going to start my introduction with one of these summaries, unless you have any other things that you would like to add.
Onward. We, as a reminder, have a triple header in today's episode, but pretty slim chapters, and that seems to be a trend in this section of Book 3, The Dragon Reborn. So we are today talking about Chapter 15, The Gray Man, Chapter 16, Hunters 3, and Chapter 17, Red Sister. So Tylor, dig into The Gray Man.
So in The Gray Man, Egwene and Nynaeve find themselves kind of abruptly outside of the Amyrlin study, and there is no one there. They briefly talk about whether or not they are going to be targets or whether or not they will go completely unnoticed. And they basically realize that they must be a threat to the Black Aja, and the Black Aja must be after them because otherwise Liandrin wouldn't have worked so hard to get rid of them. They have a brief discussion about whether or not they are going to use violence despite their promise to follow the oaths, and then they try to go to Elayne's room, hoping to catch up with her after whatever she's just been through. She is not there, and then they stop abruptly and suddenly avoid being hit by a crossbow bolt seemingly out of nowhere. Nynaeve spots a man. She channels wind or air to try to capture him. It works successfully, but when they get over to him, he has a dagger through the heart and is dead. He also doesn't have a crossbow, so the girls rightly assume that there must be another one of these people or things that is attacking them. At this point, Sheriam arrives. She is shocked to see the dead man. The girls lie and say that they found him dead, and she says that this is one of the soulless, a gray man, which she describes as someone who has given up their soul to the Dark One, and they seem to have kind of the ability to go unnoticed in some way. They are told to keep quiet, and they are sent to Nynaeve's room. When they ask Sheriam why she's there, she basically says, stop asking questions. Egwene goes to recover the crossbow bolt under kind of a thin lie and realizes that it is not there. At this point, once they leave, they are discussing kind of the bolt, what happened to it, and also Sheriam's weave that she used to hide the body, which they are quite interested in. We then get a brief description of how the power works, and the characters think at the end of the chapter, Sheriam did one odd thing, which is she didn't wonder who stabbed the gray man. And that is a really long description of a chapter that I only have 3 things to talk about, because I think this was moving the pieces and introducing a new monster. What was your thoughts on this chapter?
Yeah, it seems to me that the most significant point in this chapter is just the fact that the Tar Valon is not safe, right? The
Mhm.
tower is not safe. The tower can be infiltrated. And, that is a familiar trope to fantasy. I don't read fantasy books. I don't know her. But it does seem to me that when you establish like a really, really safe, secure space, and then you have that be infiltrated, that just demonstrates that you don't understand the powers you're up against. And it seemed to me, if I had to sum up this in a sentence, it would be that idea that,
Yeah.
new villain, and that villain can go anywhere.
Yeah. And I think that that is kind of how I find myself attracted to this chapter as a reader. And then as a podcaster, I go, and what do I say other than cool, new spooky name for a monster that seems to just be a person with a crossbow? So
Mm.
as I always do, think the first half of this chapter only has one interesting thing to talk about because there's only one kind of big character beat in it. We get a little bit of a catch up with Nynaeve, I think, in a way that we really haven't up to this point, right? We've heard her talk about Lan a little bit. We've gotten a few kind of hints at where she's at. But early in this chapter, we get Nynaeve talking about what her objective is in terms of she kind of goes off on this tangent about wanting to be an Aes Sedai. We hear her talking about violence and how she doesn't want Egwene to be consumed by it. And then also, just generally speaking, I think Nynaeve is kind of oscillating in this chapter between trying to kind of dominate Egwene in conversations like she used to when she was the wisdom, and trying to listen to her a bit more than she had in the past. And so I found all of those like really tiny glimpses that we see in bits and pieces here and there throughout the chapter. But Nynaeve is the one who I saw getting the character spotlight here.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I would fold into everything you just said. It felt to me like, particularly when she uses the power on the assassin, it's like, oh,
Yeah.
this feels different than previous times we've seen her engage with it. I mean, I think I'm at least always kind of clocking how Nynaeve seems to be more powerful than anybody before. And
Yep.
this emphasis on air and manipulating air felt new and different to me. Is that a misunderstanding, or is this to you something we're seeing change?
I think that this is something that I would tie into actually what was going to be my last point in the chapter. At the end of this chapter, we get a much more detailed description of how channeling works as like a kind of mechanical system, right? We learn that there are 5 powers that are a part of the one power. So that's fire, air, earth, water, and spirit, I believe is what they call the 5th one. And so that I think sets up a lot of new ways to describe the
Mm.
power. And what's interesting to me is what you're saying is this feels very new. I think the answer is yes, it is. And I'm not sure whether that is because our characters have now learned it sometime while traveling with Varen, and so they're describing it differently, or if this is one of those things that I think Robert Jordan does quite a bit in books 2 and 3, which is like the almost retcon, where I don't think it actually contradicts anything that came before, but it's definitely a brand new thing that gets introduced, similar to like how Varen's face was very recognizable in book 3 and no one commented on it in book 2.
Mm. Marty McFly hates to be called a chicken again, just to
Exactly.
make sure we continue that reference. So, okay, interesting and good to know. And it's a neat outgrowth of how we understood the power, because it's not like it revolutionarily changes how we understood it. It's kind of a natural thing. Go ahead.
Sorry, I just remembered we did actually have one hint of this in the previous book. If
Mm.
Earth is one of the 5 powers and people can seemingly be like extra good at one of the powers, remember that Egwene was prized by the Shanshan because she could identify metals, probably something related to the power of Earth.
I thought her job was beach, but maybe I'm confusing my media here. So it doesn't feel like you're changing something core to it. It's just a newer understanding, a more nuanced understanding of it.
Yeah.
I like the idea of like, I can major in earth at Tarvale or in water. I really wanted to go for a Fifth Element joke, but even I was like, that's just too dated. It's just, no, it just
Yeah.
doesn't. Yeah.
I've just been watching. I finished or Avatar a few years ago, and I'm just now, I have like 5 episodes left in Legend of Korra. So anytime we talk about elements, that's all I can think of in my head. And also how much I hate the other Avatar. So let's change the subject. Anything else you wanted to say about kind of Nynaeve? I see her as just getting a little bit more fleshing out in this chapter, even if none of it's super new. It's just kind of good reminder of where she's at and what's changed for her. Was there anything else on that standard that stood out to you?
This is silly and personal, but I will say I have entirely converted now in my head away from the erroneous older Nynaeve I used to picture and
Yeah.
completely picture the actress from the show. And it's funny how that automatically makes me like her a little bit more. I guess I'm just here to confess ageism, but it is like, she seems more relatable and all the time she seems like you're saying kind of pushing back and talking down. That all worked really well in my head when it was like an elderly person being like, I've learned all these things. I'm called the wisdom. And
Right.
now it's like, well, you got like 3 years on these kids. Like it feels a little different and it hits a little differently. But we talked previously about how that's not something happens to you, but certainly now, and that just goes for all these characters. Like,
Yeah.
I totally pictured the Egwene from the show dodging the crossbow bolt, not my previous picture of her. So not really anything worth like saying it's good or bad. It's just how it is now, and it's an interesting psychological fact, I think, for a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that just kind of underscores what for me is a really interesting piece of this chapter. If you start thinking about these characters as really similar in age, which is the fact that a decent chunk of Egwene's kind of narration of Nynaeve is being frustrated with her for dominating conversations when they're about to be on the same level in the White Tower. And I think for
Mm.
me, that's a conflict that I think works better now that I've got that, they actually are very similar in age. Whereas otherwise, I think you're right. It's so easy to just put one of them in the older people category and one of them in the young people category. Um,
Yeah.
if that's what we've got to say about Nynaeve, I then want to jump to Sheriam. Because I think that her arrival is really unexpected in this chapter. I don't have anything to say about the action, if you will. It's like 3 sentences. And then at the end of the chapter, I think Nynaeve does raise a really good question, right? Sheriam isn't acting in the way that one would if they were kind of investigating a surprising scene for
Mm.
significant portions of that sequence. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on Sheriam, the mistress of novices. She is now getting at least a small kind of red light in the same way that I've been flashing next to Varen for a couple of books. What are your thoughts here?
Well, I made a note in my notes because I was trying to remember from last week. There was a short list of people who the Emerald seat said could be trusted. Was Sheriam on that list, or am I crazy?
Sheriam was. So the
Yeah.
list, I think it almost seemed like Siwan was listing people from kind of like least trustworthy to most. And I think there were 6 people on that list, and Sheriam was the first. So she's kind of on the edge of the inner circle, it kind of seems like.
Well, and again, not revealing anything, but people just heard me on Friday stumble over, isn't that other person? And I definitely thought that this character had appeared on the show and was the woman having a conversation with Moraine. You corrected me in that episode that, again, if people are going chronologically, they just heard where it said, no, that was a different figure. That was a green. Is that correct?
I believe so. I'm not recalling the
Yeah.
exact conversation, but yes,
A green or a blue, the one that happened in the sauna. But
that was a blue.
a blue. Blue is the medics on the show, the healers.
Yellow are the medics on the show. Blue are the spies on the show.
I don't think you've watched Guardians of the Galaxy 3 yet, but I'm
I have
having
not.
flashbacks
I'm
to
sure.
there's a great moment where no, you press red to talk to blue and yellow to talk to green, and one of the characters is like, it's quite intuitive, and I'm feeling that way. So Sheriam was on the list, but seems very suspicious in these dealings, I think that surprised me a little bit, but I think the last set of chapters trained us to question everything and
Right.
everyone and kind of build down to this core of I trust Suan, Moraine, and our 2 girls and nobody else. And so I found it interesting. She volunteered all the information very quickly, and it's like, well, is this lore that everybody knows? I guess I would assume yes,
Yeah.
just not our novices. But also it's like, well, the seems to be, like I said at the beginning, if this is shaking us to the core of our institution, she should be a little more worried.
Yeah, and I think for me, this is one of those places, at least the first time I read this series, and I don't want to give anything about whether I was right or not, but my immediate reaction to this sequence is like they were trying to get us suspicious of everyone in the last chapter. Sheriam was the first person that we had to be suspicious of. It must be a red herring. Like, I'm sure I was
Hmm.
overthinking that at like 12 or whatever, but that was my immediate reaction is like, oh, I trust Sheriam more than I did before. This
Hmm.
feels like it's almost too suspicious to come right after the Be Afraid of the Black Aja lecture that we basically got. Um,
You're
in
you're playing the it's not lupus Dr. House rules, right? Because they
Exactly.
always hit lupus first. So yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Um, Honestly, my third star was something we've already briefly discussed, is kind of the fleshing out of how the power works. Was there anything else in this chapter that stood out to you? Like, I don't know about you, but the action and the gray man don't do a whole lot for me in terms of doing anything other than advancing the plot.
I was having flashbacks to the first season of Pandemic Legacy. You ended up with Faded and Fallen and like Falling and Fractured. And I was like, oh, another like random name, Soulless. Now we have the
Yep,
Soulless, we have the Fades, we have the Forsaken. It's like it's not that they're all the same monster, but I'm like, okay, I'm definitely confusing all of these because
totally.
I'm the guy who still says Dark Fiends like half the time. So I think I'm a little nervous about that and adding a new one to the mix, but a good new baddie is good. I think the other message of this is just last chapter we were told this is bigger than you think it is, and we are immediately like, oh, he must have one accomplice. It's like, no, he must have like seven accomplices.
Yeah.
So I'm in that kind of trust no one 70s conspiracy film mood. So with that, let's go to chapter 16, The Hunters 3.
Yeah, there's no better way to follow up. This feels like a spy film than let's just add an extra conspirator with no background check at all. So in Hunters 3, we first enter Nynaeve's room. It's much nicer than the novice quarters. Elayne is already there, as are her brothers. They're arguing with her about why she left and how angry their mother was. And they're basically trying to get her to tell them where she went so that they can A, protect her better in the future, and B, tell their mother and hopefully calm her down. Eventually, Nynaeve realizes the only way to get rid of them is basically to count at them like they are toddlers, and somehow it works. They all leave relatively quickly, and then Elayne has a brief conversation with Egwene about her brothers and how Egwene shouldn't be mooning over Galad, as she puts it. Instead, she should go after Gawain, and we get a little bit of a background about those two characters. We learned that Galad saved Gawain's life when they were young, and so Gawain now kind of feels like he owes everything to Galad. Um, there's a joke about Egwene choosing to be green so that she could marry Gawain and then they'd be sisters. Um, Nynaeve then abruptly changes the subject. Elayne asks what they were talking about with the Amyrlin. Egwene basically tries to kind of back off of that and keep it a secret. And Nynaeve immediately is like, nah, we're going to tell her everything, and then tells her everything. Elayne agrees to participate in the adventure, both because she says she needs to be brave in order to be queen, and because she likes the idea of doing something fun rather than just scrubbing pots. Nynaeve then shares her worries that the Amyrlin is going to let Mat die. She announces her plan to heal him herself. Everyone joins in, gathers up supplies, and then the door opens and it's an Aes Sedai. This right here is a classic splainer chapter in my book. We learn a lot of things and don't do much else, but it's engaging for what it is. What did you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think these are just the necessary evil when, especially when you're trying to get this plot kind of spun up and ticking along, you
Yeah.
got to spend some time building this out. I think my primary takeaway here is like, man, I just don't care about these boys.
Yeah.
I my note is like the boys, they still exist. Like, okay. And they just kind of exit,
Yep.
ignobly. And it seems to me I am running on the assumption we're not going to actually see much more of them. And I think it's just a reminder that they exist so that, they'll be around for future plots and can be linked in, whether that's later in this book or my money would be on later books to remember they're around. And we learned a lot last week about the conflict between the Queen and the Aes Sedai. So I guess it is important to place them within that and just show where they kind of are in that constellation of politics. But yeah, it explained it, and then we moved on. And oh, boys, maybe we should be interested in boys. Nah, like we got
Yeah.
bigger fish to fry right now.
Yeah, I feel like we basically get 2.5 pages that I could have completely summarized as like Galad is handsome, Gawain is earnest, Egwene love triangle. Move on. Like that's
Yeah.
the entirety of what we needed to get out of it. Um, and so I think to some degree, I want to skip to the second half of this chapter. I don't have
Sure.
much else to say about the boys unless you do.
No, that's everything I had.
Excellent.
It's also a very short chapter. We should just
It is
acknowledge. It's not
absolutely.
like we're
It's eight
skipping.
pages. Yeah. Uh, let's talk about Elayne a little bit because while I think you're right, her brothers kind of fade into the background extremely quickly, in part because they fall for the oldest trick in the book, which is the slow three. But I think Elayne actually works in contrast to her brothers, right? We learn a lot about her in terms of what she likes about Gawain and doesn't like about Galad and how she responds to new information in this chapter. And she's a character who I think has always been in kind of just the edge of the spotlight before. So this is as close to really getting something shined on her as we have gotten so far. What are your thoughts about the daughter heir of Andor?
I think it is what you said, and I mean we keep talking about people getting promoted to the sitcom regular as a metaphor for this, but it very much feels like the beginning of Two Towers, where you're like, here's Eowyn and Eomar and the guy I can't remember, Carl Urban. Hey, he's here too.
Yeah, that one.
Maybe he's Eomar. But it's like you're all of a sudden like, oh, I guess I care about more people now, and it doesn't kind of click naturally. But this does feel like Elayne stepping up. And in terms of like character sketches, this is a super fascinating one, right?
Yeah.
Like seems worthy of our attention to say, okay, it's the heir to an incredibly powerful political throne. It's somebody whose heart belongs to the warrior sorcerer group,
Yeah.
and she's literally being yanked between them and trying to negotiate that. And there's a little more on that next chapter which we can hint at, but I think it's like a really compelling character. All that being said, I'm also like, okay, like, yep, back to the characters I love most of the time when the focus is on her.
Yeah, I think the reason that I get excited about Elayne in this chapter is because exactly what you're describing. We get kind of like it almost feels like a contradictory story in some way, right? She's like super duty bound to these two groups and torn between them. And then her response when given a way to ignore both of those problems is yes, absolutely. She's like, I want to get involved in this other third thing you're doing. And as someone who constantly is on his 18th project of the month, I just relate to that at a very personal level. To some degree, then the rest of this chapter is Nynaeve both kind of trying to prepare Elayne. And I think the question that I have is like, why did Nynaeve immediately trust Elayne and give her all of the information, right? Because that's the one piece of this that I'm like, okay, Egwene is finally being cautious the way that Nynaeve has been telling her to be for 5 chapters. And then Nynaeve just does the opposite.
Yeah, here on my virtual background's not gonna let me do it. In my notebook, I just have at the end of the page, I just have why ellipsis question mark. Like
Yeah.
because I think that's capturing exactly what you said. It's like these were the explicit instructions, and not only that, but Elayne was sent out of the room to deliver the
Yeah.
instructions. And so it seems to me it just has to be significant that they're immediately breaking their instructions and drawing her in. So I think you're right. It's a little surprising it's Nynaeve. And, we've had this gag before where one character follows the instructions and the other
Yep.
pushes. And it's usually some combination of the boys, which is a little
Matt.
more expected. Matt, yeah, true. And so I think it is significant that they are breaking that
Yep.
rule. And I mean, when I say significant, I mean it means this is how something horrible happens, right?
Yep.
Because we got a reminder of the goofy boys, maybe Elayne tells the goofy boys, or it just something's gonna spin out of control because they are not taking this as seriously as they should. And it just seems like that classic moment where you're like, no, why stop? Like
Yeah.
you should know better, and characters don't, and that's the fun, right?
Yeah.
If everything went hunky dory, nobody would read the book.
I mean, I might still because I love these characters, but no, that's a totally valid point. The end of the chapter is them preparing for an adventure that then immediately do not go on. I guess my only question for you is how much did you get faked out by thinking that a decent chunk of this book was going to be let's go chase down Matt and make sure that he gets healed the way he needs to?
It's interesting. I guess I got faked out a bit because I thought, somebody should care about Matt. He seems like he's of all our kind of classic characters. They mention him a lot, but he's not really
Yeah.
doing much. So it felt a little bit like, oh, like finally he's getting his due, and then it's like, oh no. So I did fall for it a little bit, but I can't say I was terribly upset because that doesn't sound like an interesting plot.
Yeah, I mean that's totally fair. Let's go do medicine is not usually what we're looking for in our fantasy novels. Um, that's kind of what I had here. It's a relatively brief chapter, and like we said, it's one where I think the characters are conveying information that we already know to each other, which is always a lovely thing to see as a reader of a series like this, but it leaves us with a little bit less to say about it because we've kind of discussed a lot of these topics already. Any last things you wanted to say here before we get into chapter 17?
I got nothing else in my notes other than still why question mark.
Why?
But yeah, move on.
Yeah, excellent. Chapter 17, The Red Sister. The Aes Sedai who entered the room was Elaida. She is wearing almost all red, and she is unsurprised to see them all together, although she does comment on it repeatedly. She will not give any of them permission to leave the room and tells Nynaeve that she needs to give up her herbs if she's ever going to become a real Aes Sedai. She berates Elayne for severing the ties between the tower and her mother, and then she basically jumps to a completely different topic of conversation by asserting that the Black Aja are among them and possibly after them. She basically then wonders aloud how Nynaeve and Egwene were able to convince Elayne to leave because she's the daughter of Andor and is so important. Elayne insists that she did it of her own free will, and Elaida is furious at her for not staying quiet like she was told to. At this point, Elaida tells her to break herself of bad habits. And Elaida is really explicit about what her goal for Elayne is in a way that I don't think we've gotten before. She says that she wants Elayne to be the first Aes Sedai ruler who has been open about it in the last 2,000 years. Elaida says that she needs to know why they left so that she can protect them. But Egwene says that the Merlin told them, Egwene says that they did it to help Matt get healed. And then Nynaeve jumps in and says that the Merlin told them not to tell anyone and that everything was past. Elaida seems to acknowledge that and allows them to kind of get out of that conversation, and then immediately turns the subject of the discussion to Rand. She says she knows he must be ta'veren, but she kind of is asking them what else they know. Egwene is scrambling for what she can say that won't give anything away, and at that point, Sheriam enters. Elaida leaves after they have a terse back and forth. Elayne accuses Elaida of threatening her and is told she must have misheard. And then Nynaeve basically makes it clear very quickly that Elayne knows about the Gray Man. Sheriam is very upset about this, but says that they don't have time to deal with that now because she is there to take them to get Matt healed. And given that the next chapter that we are going to be reading is called Healing, we can expect that we'll continue on this plot line in the next week. So once again, reintroduction of a character. Not a ton else here, but were there any like details that really grabbed you or things that excited you in this really, really brief chapter? I think it was only 5 pages in my edition.
Uh yeah, I mean, I think the key point here, we'd met Elida before. You rightfully just said reintroduction. I don't know why I'm like giving you your flowers for that, but sure, good job remembering reintroduction. I will say I personally read this character much more through her faction, right? She's wearing all red, and so I was immediately thinking of a red, and that kind of colored, say with rose-colored glasses, everything that I've viewed here, except the opposite of rose-colored glasses.
Yeah.
Because we primarily know Red through Leandrin, and they seem like the Slytherin, right? It's
Yeah.
like, why do we let these people in? Why are we training our enemies and our future generations of enemies? We'll just roll with it. But it seems to me that when I have that in mind, everything filtered down to power, and that the red faction is pissed that the blue's in charge and they want to pull people there.
Yeah.
So I felt that the way she kind of recounted everything, I didn't really suspect she was of the black. Just to be clear, it was much more like, okay, I need Elayne to become the first Aes Sedai queen of Andor, and oops, she's a red, and I get all that power from my house faction
Right.
group. So it felt to me like that was the whole motivation here.
Yeah, and I think if we're thinking about like what are the things that Elaida is focusing on here, I think it really does kind of bring into focus what the Reds are all about, right? Because one, she's interested in Rand, which makes sense because Reds hunt down men who can channel. And so if Elaida knows that he is Taviran, she probably has at least some suspicion that he might be the dragon or might be able to channel or might have something like that. So Reds would obviously kind of directly be interested in that. And then, as you say, the other thing that I think Reds are really concerned about in a lot of cases is power, right? They recognize that in order to kind of influence all of the places they need to in order to get where the false dragons are or the channelers are and gentle all of these men, they need connections in all of the major places. They need militaries who are willing to assist them if a false dragon raises an army. And so Elaida makes that really clear how important the ties to Andor are, and this seems like kind of the double blow to her in this case, right? One, she has lost her position in Camelin. She's no longer working with Queen Morghese. And then two, as you say, kind of the protege that she was hoping to develop into the next great queen and be kind of the star that she gets on her resume, is now potentially getting kicked out of school, and that's not the ideal outcome. What really struck me here is you're right. I think this really frames what the Red Aja is all about, and we get that early introduction that highlights just how red of a red Elaida is. But I think the other thing we get here is Elaida has absolutely no chill, right? Like we thought Moraine was someone who was really driven and really direct, but Elaida makes Moraine look like a really nice, polite person in this scene.
Yeah, excellent point. And, to me, that says, I read that less as this is her character, as in she almost lost it all, right?
Yeah.
Like her whole plan, her whole designs for herself. And yeah, the way you just described her actually made me think of a different Harry Potter reference, which is Slughorn, who kind of collects gem students to kind of be able to brag that, he got season tickets or whatever. And it felt a little like that. Like if she can be the one to control the Queen of Andor, or to put the Aes Sedai as the Queen of Andor, I think that is clearly the goal and what's there.
I think if we're making just the contrast between Elaida and Moraine, I also just want to highlight the fact that Elaida is kind of staking her reputation on one woman who will be one of the most powerful channelers of the next generation. Moraine had two of those and was like, nah, I'll follow this dude. So like Moraine is driven in a way that I think we need to acknowledge here.
Well, that's a good point. And yeah, I think especially because it's our characters, I think her coming in so hot or lacking chill it just makes me dislike her. It's like, yeah, leave my friends alone. It's that kind of guttural reaction you have. Not guttural, gut reaction you have. I mean, maybe guttural. I don't know what language you used when expressing it. But that gut reaction you have where you're like, no, I'm not on your side. I'm on this side. And it was a lot of that there. But it was really interesting that I never once was like, here's a black Aja. Here's, I think there is a way in which the way to put yourself on the same side is to expose some, right? Like, in her mind, she is informing them that the Black Aja is here, and that should endear her and put her on her side. And so there's a way in which now I'm in like triple negatives that should make me suspect her for giving up some of that. but I did not suspect her. I just disliked her. But I
Yeah.
think, between our show episodes, you can hear us talk about in 2 days. I'm remembering the timeline. And this, I'm coming to appreciate a lot more that Tar Valon is not a monolithic tower. It is wrapped up in politics, and this just felt purely like factions fighting factions, not at all really caring about the Dragon Reborn. Now, to me, the Dragon Reborn is the kind of existential threat that should make all the factions come together,
Mm-hmm.
or make some split off and join him like the Black Aja seem to be doing. So interested to see where that builds to, because it feels important in the moment, but also, it is very much Game of Thrones, where you're like, stop fighting. There's a bunch of ice zombies coming,
Yep.
and you all need to get that together. And some of the better criticism I saw of George R. R. Martin in the show said it was like a climate change metaphor, which I
Yep.
think is great as a reading, because it's like, yeah, we should not be fighting each other about, I don't know, gender identity in school curriculum. We should save the planet, or else we're all
Right.
going to die. So it works here to be like, I'm kind of sick of this character. I'm like, your goals are wrong.
I think to some degree, what you're highlighting is why I like this book so much more than the first two. I think the first two books are very much in a kind of light and dark kind of storytelling mode, right? They're very like epic and big. And as a result, there's like the Forsaken or Baal Zaman always around the corner. I really love this book because we get so much more gray, right? Just in the past like 4 chapters, we've already had doubts about Sheriam, and we know Leandrin is evil. And Elaida doesn't necessarily feel black, but she definitely feels bad. And we've talked about how the White Tower is kind of a corrupt organization. And we've just got a list of like all of the things we thought were clean are just a little bit tainted in some way. And I think that that works really well to kind of expand the overall way that this world has been built as kind of like fallen from something greater. I just want to acknowledge kind of the sum total of all of the little details that you're describing add up to something that I think works really well across all of these chapters.
Uh, Tell it to me like it's Star Wars. The more recent Star Wars movies have their flaws, and I promise you, listeners, we could list them all. But one of the things I thought, particularly Last Jedi was doing, is trying to say, like, we need to get away from light side, dark side thinking,
Mm-hmm.
and think about more nuances here. And I really liked that as a metacultural gesture. And
Yep.
I would put this in the same category, right? When you
Mm-hmm.
come out of the original Star Wars and the similar media of the 70s, it's like, Vietnam's awful. We can't tell the good guys from the bad guys. Nothing makes sense anymore. Let's just have an escapist story where it's black and white.
Yeah.
And I think so much of that kind of 80s Amblin, Lucas, everything is like, yes, Indiana Jones is punching Nazis. You
Right.
don't question which side you're on. But then as we think about the time period this is coming out, as we move into the 90s, and these books are part of that cultural moment, I think it's actually a lot of the more sophisticated storytellers saying, like, actually, it's kind of dangerous to think about things as good guys, bad guys, us, them. Let's
Yeah.
think about this much more in the complexity of it. And while that is less escapist as a myth, I actually think it's more informative, more educational, right?
Yeah.
Like, hey, I love escapism, but I don't want to teach my kids there's us and them, there's good guys, bad guys. It's a lot more complicated than that. And so I think that was a long roundabout Star Wars way to say, like, I think Robert Jordan is nailing it here. And
Yeah.
if you imagine 12-year-old Tylor and his brethren just sitting alone in their bedrooms reading fantasy books,
Accurate.
uh, it's what they needed, right? It's like, yeah,
Accurate.
were raised on this really simplistic storytelling. Let's do something a little more complicated and push it. And, again, to tell it like it's Star Wars, Last Jedi does that, and a whole bunch of man babies lose their freaking minds.
Mm-hmm.
I just had one on my
I
Instagram
saw.
this morning, like I gotta tell you why that's wrong. It's like, dude, nobody cares what you think anymore. And I think there is a way in which I imagine that this kind of storytelling challenges everybody much more. And people like you and I think embrace that challenge,
Yeah.
whereas other people say, like, no, 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 I want the escapism. And I
Yeah.
try to respect it still, that is a perfectly valid thing to go to stories for. But I think this is a clear sign that this book is going to challenge us much more than the previous two.
And I will say my like ideal mix is like 75% gray, 25% like cottagecore warm in my like insides, right? And I think that there has been like if Robert Jordan and we think about kind of like more modern filmmaking, I'd say like fantasy novels were a little ahead of the film industry on this. But if we're thinking of that generation as like, okay, let's kind of like mix some of this gray and some of that adult into our otherwise escapist fantasy, I will say I have a problem sometimes when we go too much beyond that. Like Game of Thrones is just a little too all gray for me. I need someone to actually be a good person in my stories. And so I think Robert Jordan, I want to applaud him for both pushing the boundaries of more complex storytelling, but also still having that like grounding of like some moral guidance of the world. Like I think that combination works really well for me here. And I think Elaida as kind of an interesting kind of pivot point to understand all of those sides is really interesting, right? She's mean but not necessarily evil, and red but not black, and all of these like angles that make her seem not great but also not like a villain in the traditional sense.
Well, and I do think you're right. I kind of skipped a generation in some ways in my illusion, and I just want to acknowledge like somebody like George R. R. Martin directly said like, yeah, I read Wheel of Time and wanted to do that but
Yeah,
harder.
right.
And I think while I can't trace specific modern storytellers, they all say I was the nerd reading fantasy books and playing Dungeons and Dragons, and now I
Yeah,
get to make Star Wars, Marvel, fill in your franchise of choice. And I think that's where it's showing up. And you know, this is a time where we need those stories, and I think it's just a credit to the fantasy authors
yeah,
for being ahead of it, and that is why fantasy. But like, there are these people out there who don't read fantasy. I can't think of one off the top of my head, but people who don't read fantasy, I think it's often because they don't appreciate that about it. They get
yeah.
lost in the swords and the armor and the dragons without actually thinking about what the mythology and the thematic content is. And so if you zoned out because I was rambling too much in the last 10 minutes, read fantasy. There's some good stuff in it.
Well, and I think to some degree where we ended up on this chapter is talking about a bunch of big like philosophical ideas, because to some degree this chapter is reintroduction to Elaida. Hey guys, here's kind of what the plot might look like for the next couple of chapters. And
Mm.
that's it, right? There's not as much to dig into other than this new character. And I'm pretty okay with that, right? Like, this is a chapter where I think a bad fantasy author gives us a 20-page chapter called The Red Sister. And
Hmm.
I think even Robert Jordan, maybe in the first book of this series, gives us a 20-page chapter called The Red Sister. But I think as the series goes on and he kind of realizes what are the important things he wants to focus on, yet this can be 5 pages. I'm very happy with that.
Yeah, totally. And let's not even talk about the boys this chapter, right?
Yeah.
I was in my head while reading this trying to rewrite the Schuyler sisters to be about somebody, Elaida, and Gawad, but I didn't get there because I couldn't figure out who the somebody is.
Yeah.
So there's my assignment to our listeners: write the parody song of the Schuyler sisters about, I don't know, these people or the Aja or something. I think you have to just add a syllable to Elayne. Elayne, or no, I don't know. I'm not there yet. I'll leave it to the experts. So, to wrap up this week, again, most importantly, we'll see you in 2 days for a discussion of episodes 5 and 6 of the television program. And after that, we will see you next week for another triple header. We are enjoying 3 chapters again, and still, I think it might even be shorter next week. These are
Yeah.
slim little chapters. We have chapter 18, Healing, chapter 19, Awakening, and chapter 20, Visitations. Chapters as short as their titles, as the case may be.
Yeah, I think that we are getting towards the section of the book where Robert Jordan, I almost feel him getting impatient in these chapters. He's like, okay, I know I need to do all of these things. I know you haven't read about some of these characters in 800 pages, so I need to reintroduce them. But I can almost feel him in some of these chapters being like, okay, check that box, check that box, check that box. Let's do it. And the next 3 weeks that we have, I'm very excited about, mostly because we can finally resolve one of the biggest complaints I have about the first 3 books. How do we have 5 major young characters and one of them doesn't get a chapter until next week? through the glass columns.
So ends another episode of Through the Glass Columns. We thank you for joining us and continuing with us on our quest to cover all of the Wheel of Time in our own sweet time.
This podcast features original content developed by Tylor Orm and Greg Cass and is not in any way affiliated with, associated with, or condoned by the Robert Jordan Estate, Tor Fantasy, or Amazon. All content is intended for entertainment and educational purposes only.
If you're enjoying this podcast, please seek out the books from your local bookshop or library and join us as we continue our journey. If you'd like to contact us to share your thoughts or give feedback, you can email us at throughtheglasscolumns@gmail.com or find us on Instagram and Twitter by searching Through the Glass Columns.
Thank you once again for being part of this community. If you're enjoying the show, please subscribe to the show, leave us a review wherever you're listening, and recommend this show on your social media to help us grow our community. We look forward to welcoming you back next time through the Glass Columns.